Howdy ho! This is your friendly neighborhood quantum sheriff. So this is the day of my court appearance on actually completely unrelated matters, but I felt this was the best opportunity for everybody for me to express my sovereignty and begin interacting with the world form. I've put it off. I think I wasn't ready for it. Now I am. One way or another, I'm ready for it. So, here goes. Here's my public, so rather than, I'm just going to read it, and in the process of doing this, I'm also giving my full name just as an example. So I'm just going to read it verbatim, and I'll try to make eye contact sometimes, but you know how it is. So here is an expression of my sovereignty. This is a formal and public declaration of sovereignty. The declaration is as follows. 1. The consciousness occupying the human instrument, in most cases, in most capacities, as Keith Richard Levine, now referred to as John, Jon, actually, by the way, for the remainder of this declaration, is a sovereign consciousness or entity of prime creator, living in recognition of his individual sovereignty by expressing it. Concisely, prime creator is another name for the source of all things. In religious doctrine, this is referred to as God. In scientific doctrine, this is referred to as an event labeled the Big Bang. In various spiritual circles, it is referred to as source, prime creator, or the one absolute. All of these labels are mentioned to exemplify the meaning of what is invoked with prime creator, when prime creator is used within this declaration. 2. The individual John is acting in an official capacity regarding the idea and individual, the idea of individual and collective sovereignty. This is more than the following, but surmised in the statement of the individual consciousness or entity is capable of choice and choosing of and for itself. Coinciding, this view being that the individual is the foundational building block of society, community, culture, referred to as a collective system for the remainder of this declaration. Refusal to acknowledge the role and sovereignty of the individual is attributing an individual consciousness to being an unliving cog that turns the mechanical collective structure, translating to a collective system that is stuck on autopilot. Recognizing this, the collective world is literally created from the individual and their choice. And refusal for a collective agreement to recognize the sovereignty of the individual can only create a collective agreement that is unsustainable and destined for collapse, destined for internal collapse. In recognizing individual sovereignty, the collective system can be held accountable through individuals, and in turn, the collective system begins operating as a sovereign system itself. Only in sovereignty can a truly sustainable system exist. Thus, the goal of system-wide recognition of individual sovereignty coincides with the goal of creating a sustainable and sovereign collective system. Translated into other words, this is the best gift we can give our children. Not only the right to live in a liberated theoretical sense, but to grant them the gift of bearing witness to being a living example of it. To further define and prove the inherent value and benefit of collective recognition of individual sovereignty, the individual entity is only able to fully participate and thus be of full value and benefit within a collective system if A, the individual consciousness recognizes its own sovereignty, and B, the individual chooses on its own accord to participate within a super agreement or super contract involving multiple individuals. Translated into other words, faith in the system creates a sustainable system. It is impossible to have real faith in a system if one is not consciously choosing it for themselves. Without this recognition of conscious participation, a collective system can only exist temporarily and through the application of invoking fear amongst would-be participants. This fear is brought about through violence, mentally, physically, emotionally, etc. And as individuals begin to reject the notion of being driven to fear, the unsustainable collective system, incapable of choosing any other option, is forced to become ever increasingly violent in an attempt to preserve itself. Innately, individuals will become increasingly non-compliant with the system that is becoming increasingly violent, and then the system will continue to increase its violence in an attempt to create compliance collectively. So translated into other words, an unsustainable system exists through the use of application of fear. Fear, as the primary or only foundation for a system, collective or individual, is eventually rejected by the system itself and will cause a collapse from within. It is only by and in faith that a sustainable system, collective or individual, is created, and ultimately, one can only have faith in a system they choose themselves. Obviously, this declaration is not only a statement regarding the expressed individual sovereignty of John as an individual entity or consciousness, but is also acting as a statement of observation regarding systems in general and how recognition of individual sovereignty is not only paramount, but instrumental in establishing a sustainable collective system. Let's check on time here. Gotta hurry this up. So, 3. An individual can only recognize and live as a sovereign entity to the extent that they are in recognition and honor the inherent sovereignty of other individuals. Individual sovereignty is inherent. However, unless this is recognized on an internal basis by the individual in question, the individual is asleep to the possibility of choice and acts in an irresponsible manner where victimhood is maintained and choice is not seen as an internal process, but as an external influence. Sovereignty thus remains unrecognized, and this individual is thus unexpressed in action and mannerism. Translated into other words, sovereignty only exists if one lives by and applies it to oneself and the universe one exists within. Even if the potential for sovereignty exists within any individual, only the individual that chooses to express their sovereignty, for lack of a better word, has it. Furthermore, individuals are likely to be expressing their sovereignty in varying degrees. Thus, not all individuals expressing their sovereignty are equal in their expression. And thus, a universal template regarding sovereignty is required to be recognized alongside sovereignty itself. And so this is 4. Sovereignty and living as an expression of it translates into living by a golden rule and is verily the universal template for all individuals to agree upon. Without this universal template, individuals cannot interface with the collective system simply on faith, as the system will favor one people over another classification of people. And the unfavored people inadvertently are forced into participation by the use of fear. That was number 4, by the way. Translated into other words, the universal template of the golden rule, which is to interact and consider other individuals as the observing individual would prefer to be considered and interacted with, establishes a foundational agreement that all levels of express sovereignty are able to recognize. So even in the case where one particular individual is expressing their sovereignty more entirely than another particular individual, there is agreement between them on the universal template. With this universal template in place, any system, individual or collective, is now equipped with the format necessary to engage with any other system, individual or collective. To state this in a slightly different manner, the only agreement that can be universal is we all agree to disagree. And as long as we consider and interact with others based upon this golden rule mentioned above, the disagreement is only subjective, and all involved individuals will see the benefit of forming some agreement, i.e. a conscious agreement, over the vacuum of an agreement, which translates into being an unconscious agreement. In fact, the only foreseeable circumstance by this individual, John, where no agreement can be established is when a system itself does not or is incapable of recognizing individual sovereignty. In part, this is the reason why the individual, John, has created this declaration, to stand in his expressed sovereignty before the forum of the world and ask for formal recognition. If this formal recognition is refused to be acknowledged and accepted by the collective system, no agreement can be created, and the individual John will continue to create agreements solely on an individual basis. The individual John chooses to refuse participation within and or give consent to be governed by any collective system that cannot acknowledge and accept A, the concept of individual sovereignty, and B, the expressed sovereignty of the individual John himself. 5. All contracts or agreements made before this declaration representing John are hereby and now null and void and are forgiven, untied, unbound, and unmade. Obligations or commitments with any involved party are forgiven. No debts exist to or from the individual John, and this is the debt of consent, service, obedience, or compliance, as well as from social contracts of the existing system, as of this declaration, dependent upon the official recognition of the expressed individual sovereignty of John within the context of the surrounding collective system. Attempts to reestablish some version of the former agreements will be honored and can be renegotiated over, within the capacity of mutual respect and the benefit of all concerned. Translated into other words, no one owes the individual John anything, nor does John owe anything to anyone else. 6. The individual John chooses to forgive any and all now formally existing contracts or agreements, and chooses to refuse consideration of any agreement or contract that is presented, A, from a system that refuses to accept or acknowledge the expressed sovereignty of the individual John, and B, that is presented in a deceitful manner where the individual John is not entirely aware of the implications of the agreement or contract. Translated into other words, the individual John chooses to refuse interaction on an agreement or contractual basis with any system unless his expressed individual sovereignty is acknowledged. Furthermore, if deceit is ever discovered on any level, it is the inherent right of the individual John to exercise his sovereignty by immediately forgiving the agreement or contract, as this falls under the golden rule, and the inverse is equally as true and recognized by the individual John. 7. The intent of this declaration is as follows. A, for the individual John to formally express his sovereignty in a public world forum, and B, for the existing collective system to be presented with and given the opportunity to officially begin the formal recognition of sovereignty on an individual basis. Firstly, regardless of the existing collective system's recognition of individual sovereignty, expressed or inherent, the individual John recognizes his own inherent sovereignty and is choosing to express it publicly in the form of a formal declaration. Lack of acceptance or acknowledgement on the part of the existing collective system is lack of acceptance or acknowledgement on the part of the existing collective system in no way undermines or contradicts the expressed sovereignty of the individual John in any way, shape, or form. The individual John is acting as an expression of sovereignty in the simple act of creating this declaration. This is not a privilege or a title that has been bestowed by an external source. Thus, the very act of creating a declaration of sovereignty is a direct expression and a direct example of being a sovereign entity. Translated into other words, the individual John is capable of and is expressing his ability to choose for himself. The very fact that he is creating a declaration of sovereignty when no privilege or title has been bestowed upon him by an external source granting such is direct evidence of this expression. Secondly, it is the expressed intent of the individual John to provide the opportunity for the existing collective system to begin to recognize individual sovereignty in an official context. The individual John is aware that the existing collective system does not recognize sovereignty in an individual context, and thus the collective system will continue to use violence on individuals, such as John, if they attempt to express and live their inherent sovereignty. In this example, neither individuals nor the collective system itself receive any benefit from this violence. Verily, it only endangers the collective system further by undermining what faith individuals have in it to begin with. To state the same thing in different wording, this individual John is only looking for an outlet to express his sovereignty, as well as establish an outlet for other individuals who are ready and able to declare and express their own inherent sovereignty. Furthermore, no harm or destruction is intended for the existing collective system within this declaration. In fact, if the collective system begins to recognize individual sovereignty in an official context, the existing collective system can begin to benefit from the contributions of these individuals by engaging them in agreements and contracts, and by recognizing the inherent sovereignty of all individuals. Without the collective system's recognition of individual sovereignty, these individuals, such as John, will continue to choose, in spite of the refusal to acknowledge their ability to do so. In this example, the existing collective system is unable to benefit from these individuals, as well as vice versa. This declaration is therefore seen as an act of mutual benefit for all involved. This declaration, and the opportunity for the collective system to acknowledge and accept it, is seen by the individual John as the existing collective system's final chance to either begin allowing individuals, such as John, to express their inherent sovereignty, or to begin collapsing internally from a lack of faith by participating individuals. It is the hope of this individual John that this declaration is formally accepted, or at the very least, conversation about individual sovereignty begins to be discussed in earnest on a grander scale. Regardless of the outcome dictated by the existing collective system, the individual John is a sovereign entity expressing his sovereignty, and neither the collective system nor any other individual has the capacity to nullify it in any way, shape, or form. Translated into other words, the individual John is living as a sovereign entity, and either the collective system can accept this or exist in denial over it. Regardless, the individual John is expressing his sovereignty and is no longer subject to or of any external influence or collective agreement. The individual John is creating his own choices, and this is the foundation of what this declaration was created in. And so with that, there is my declaration, putting it on a public forum right now. Depending on how court goes, I will very much add to this and try to simplify it in more common language. I didn't want to use their legalese per se, but I wanted to be clear. And part of being clear is using a lot of language, which is why I also said the same thing in many different ways. And so I'm as clear as I can possibly be. I'm not attempting deceit on any level. I'm trying to engage this collective system in the only way that I know how, and that's directly. So there we go. I'm a sovereign entity now. I know I've always been, but I'm expressing it now. And so here we go. I'm holding myself accountable. We'll see how this ends up playing out. I love you guys. And this is my last blog post, or this is my last video that I ever make. In my opinion, this is worth it. This is for everybody watching this. This is for everybody who has yet to watch it. This is for everybody, man. Definitely for my children. And no, this is for the God too, right? This is for the Prime Creator. So here we go. Working to the next step.